three, public finance, pensions, and P3s. We have three incredibly knowledgeable speakers on that subject. Of course, Toby Sanger, senior economist with CUPE, again, somebody requiring no introduction. Well-known analyst from the trade union movement. He's published many studies on tax-related issues, including fair shares, how banks, brokers, and the financial industry can pay fair taxes. We have my very old friend, old in terms of not his age, but in terms of how long we've known each other, Joel Harden, who is the Register of the Labour College of Canada. I have here Director of the Canadian Labour Congress Education Department, but I understand he has moved on from that position. He is also an adjunct prof of Labour Studies at Brock, and in addition to that, he was previously a professor of social welfare at Nipissing University, and he's currently writing an article, part of which he will be presenting here, on the Canadian Labour Congress's Retirement Security for Everyone campaign. And thirdly, but definitely not finally, we have Heather Whiteside, who's a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. She has recently co-authored a book, which I don't know if our book table has packed up, but we have copies of it out there, a rather fine book, I should say, which she co-authored with Stephen McBride, entitled Private Affluence, Private Austerity, Economic Crisis, and the Democratic Malaise in Canada. And with that, I think we will begin in that order. We'll begin with Toby.
Thanks very much. I thought that there'd be a bit of an outflux of people with the NDP convention starting down the hall, but I guess I got the wrong crowd, perhaps. There were two titles in the program, and I apologize for that confusion. I wrote that kind of late at night, and I thought it'd be a choice, but it was included as both of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the present crisis and recession, how that differed from some of the previous ones that we've had, and some of the repercussions of that. Canada's two previous post-war recessions were both explicitly and intentionally caused by the federal government raising interest rates to slow down the economy and reduce the pace of wage increases, ostensibly to reduce inflation. This isn't just me or any conspiratorial theory saying this. I've actually had senior Bank of Canada officials say, yeah, we caused the last two recessions. And this illustrates how. I've taken the Bank of Canada interest rate. Zero is when the recession started in both 1980, both 1981, 82, and also 1990, 91. In the 2 to 3 years before the crisis, the interest rate was more than doubled, and that caused the economy to slow down. Slowed down investment, increased personal and business bankruptcies, pushed unemployment to double-digit rates. And then that led the economic decline, lower revenues, higher social spending, and high interest rates also then caused large increases in government deficits. I think we really need to remember how different the recent economic crisis was than those ones. Coming out of those recessions, of course, the Canadian government's embarked on deficit-cutting crusades, largely through cuts in program spending. It also involved public sector wage freezes or constraints to share the pain with public sector workers. But despite the contractionary fiscal policies coming out of those recessions, the economies were able to ultimately grow, because the federal government then ran expansionary monetary policies. As you can see, the interest rates went considerably down. So that's what got the economies going. And interest rates were reduced by more than half. This crisis was completely different. The interest rate was, during the economic crisis, was brought down by more than half, and now we don't have the latitude to expand monetary policy to get the economy going again. Following the recessions, I've got it from the 1990s here, the consequence of the successive contractionary monetary policies for the private sector, and then also the contractionary fiscal policies, as well as direct wage suppression, was a steep decline in the rate of wage increases. The blue line there is the private sector. The green line is the public sector. So the real wage losses during that period. It wasn't until the year 2007 that public sector wages, measured by this, actually, in real terms, came back to the level that they were in the early 1990s. There was a little bit of a discussion at the end of Jim's presentation there. There were some real wage increases. The bars there are inflation, and if the lines are above it, that means there's some real wage increases. There were some real wage increases as unemployment went down, but they weren't really substantial during that period. Talked a little bit about this morning as well. So following these effectively orchestrated recessions and wage constraint measures, the share of national income going to wages and salaries has declined on a long-term basis. Sometimes it's gone up a little bit. It did go up a little bit in the early 1990s. That's because GDP went down and profits also went down. But you can see just in the recent recession, there's very little of a blip there. Wage and salary share of GDP has declined on a long-term secular basis. And what was interesting about this recent recession was there's very little talk about bankruptcies. I don't know how many of you remember 1990s or 1980s recession. Bankruptcies, business bankruptcies were on the front page as a whole, pretty much every month. There's very little of that happening right now. It was kind of interesting, just before, sort of at the beginning of this crisis, we occasionally have meetings with senior people in finance and Bank of Canada. And during the same period, a couple of them both of them remarked on how surprised they were that the shares of national income had shifted so much and profits were significantly higher than they had been before, and they had to recalibrate their models. This is picks up or reflects some of the things that Jim talked about as well. These are surpluses and deficits for the different sectors of the economy. There's a government sector, household sector, and corporate sector. And I did this, I dug in some data about 5 years ago and found this, and what was really remarkable is from the 1961 right up until the year 2000, the household sector had traditionally run a surplus, and they had led to the corporate sector. Corporate sector had borrowed money and invested in the economy, as Jim was talking about. That completely changed around the year 2000 as a consequence of low wage growth, low real wage growth, higher housing prices, and the corporate sector, that's the blue bars, have run unprecedented and massive surpluses. If you add up those bars from the year 2000 to now, it's over $500 billion. $500 billion that they have accumulated as surpluses and haven't invested back into the economy. It's gone into cash, it's gone into share buybacks, it's gone to speculative investment. We had a little bit of a discussion about it as well, but this past recession, there's been talk about inequality being a consequence of the recession. And the financial crisis, but I firmly believe that it was also a cause of it. In the 1930s and in the recent recession, inequality increased to an unprecedented level. I mean, we had the greatest increase in inequality in North America since the 1930s, and that led to much higher household debts, and we've seen that in Canada and the United States. But it also led to a whole lot of surplus being held by the financial and capital accumulation, which then went into speculative investment. And it's not just me that said that, but a number of other people from the IMF have also said that rising inequality was very likely cause of this crisis. So the 2008-2009 Great Recession was different. It's the first global economic contraction since the 1930s. There was an unprecedented growth in inequality. As I mentioned, interest rates were reduced to all-time lows. There was a incredibly coordinated global response. Unprecedented monetary stimulus, interest rates at rock bottom levels, and then quantitative easing, and a whole lot of extraordinary measures that the Bank of Canada officials had never said were possible. Far more expansionary, discretionary fiscal policy this time than in previous recessions. Chris and Tamara were talking a little bit about this, where the federal government increased its spending. I looked back at the two previous recessions. So much more money going into infrastructure and capital investment by the federal government than in previous recessions. I think previous recessions there'd been more of the automatic stabilizers. So the spending was focused on public capital investment and tax cuts, and the spending is largely temporary. Tax cuts are permanent. Fewer business bankruptcies and a much slower jobs recovery as well. Following, at the time of this crisis, I think a number of us thought, the long expected recession or crisis has occurred, and we'll have some substantial changes from this, some positive structural measures to stabilize the economy and at least marginally reduce inequalities, like happened after the long depression in the 1870s and after the 1930s Great Depression. These hopes have largely been dashed. Very marginal changes, as Greg mentioned, in the financial architecture, and on the contrary, the large deficits that were built up are being used to justify austerity measures, and I think intentionally so. Flaherty was very happy to spend as much money as possible, including giving money to the provinces so that they would bring in harmonized sales tax to build up the deficit so that he could later cut it back. The real debt crisis isn't so much at the government level. The green line there is government deficits. There are different ways of measuring it. I did this on a gross basis. If you do it on a net basis, it's considerably lower. The real debt crisis is at the household level. Household debt to personal disposable income is 150% now. Corporate debt ratios have declined dramatically. As the Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney said, I think he described it, he said the corporate sector is in rude good health, or the balance sheets are in rude good health. So what situation are we in right now? Lower interest rates can't save us. Interest rates are going up. Housing bust in Canada. The United States has deleveraged, and a number of other countries have deleveraged debt on the household side. Hasn't happened in Canada. In fact, the opposite has happened. And if there is a big decline in housing prices, there's a wealth effect, and that could bring down GDP by about 2%. Business is not investing. We're told that corporate tax cuts, businesses, supply-side economics says you give businesses corporate tax cuts. Well, they're not investing. It's remarkable if you see a chart of the corporate tax rate and the rate of business investment, it's declined in the same way. It's supposed to be going in the opposite direction. They're obviously not investing. There are a number, I want to collect some theories from some of the proponents of corporate tax cuts for why they're not investing. I've heard some from Don Drummond, from Ian Lee, and some others, come up with a whole lot of different rationalizations. And then there was also just an article in The Economist saying the same thing's happening in Britain. They're not investing. Well, they're not investing because people aren't buying their goods, right? Why invest if you can't sell your goods? Canada has fortunately had some export expansion, but it's largely limited to resources to industrializing countries. So really, the only thing that you have left is consumer spending. This is in terms of Keynesian economic national account to get the economy going. It's fiscal policy and or consumer spending. Of course, it'd be great to have business investment, but it's not happening unless people are going to buy it. So there are limited prospects for recovery. That's why people talk about another lost decade, or else I think Krugman recently talked about 7 lean this biblical reference, I guess, 7 lean and ugly years. The reality is that government debt ratios are manageable. This is a debt payment ratio as a share of GDP. The blue bar there is the maximum over a period where the figures were comparable, and the latest. It's approximately half of what it had been. This is partly because the debt levels aren't that high, but also because interest rates are extremely low. Public spending, I mean, is actually close to all-time lows. Before the recession, it dropped down to the lowest it had been, at least as far as I could see the stats. It's interesting. I rarely get into, they have comment section in the Globe and Mail. Neil Reynolds wrote some piece about a week ago about how the NDP had achieved its dreams because government was spending so much. So I kind of pointed out this was wrong, and so did a whole lot of other people. Anyhow, he came out today with a piece saying that, in fact, government spending was at a very extremely low level. So where are we now? It's almost as if we didn't have this type of recession, but the government is creating a recession to try and keep wages down. The federal government will soon be in a structural surplus. The parliamentary budget officer has mentioned this. So did TD Economics. Austerity measures will slow down the economy and could lead to another recession, as has happened in the UK and Europe. I've done some analysis and looked at fair taxes. Federal and provincial deficits could quickly be eliminated with a few fair tax measures. Spending and cuts in austerity will increase inequality by reducing the social wage. So basically, working classes are going to be paying for this crisis. We've had rising inequality. The top 1% in Canada has doubled its share of national income, and at the same time, GDP growth has declined. I mean, it's gone up and down, but it's secularly declined. Obviously, trickle-down economics doesn't work at all. So what are we likely to see in upcoming budgets? Chris had talked a little bit more about this. I think it's going to be selective austerity, wage constraints, program, public service, transfer and regulatory cuts, corporate, but at the same time it's with corporate tax cuts, stimulus directed at private sector, and widespread commodification of public services. So a lot of privatization, asset sales, contracting out P3s, competitive bidding, and then social enterprise. Social impact bonds is going to be something in the budget. I don't think governments are interested in maximizing GDP growth. They're interested in maximizing profits. Just looking back, just thinking of Jim's image of a car with an engine out of it. To use a metaphor I used a while ago, it's not just a matter of fixing the engine and putting more fuel in the tank. What we need to do, and heading off in the same direction into the ditch or off a cliff, what we need is a different type of engine, maybe a hybrid, or else perhaps public transit, and to head in a different direction, not in the same direction that we have headed off, that we've headed in. An interesting thing I just discovered a little while ago, I mean, there's been a lot of vilification of public sector workers, but this is very interesting testimony of the Associate Deputy Minister of Finance. He said that the Expenditure Restraint Act's policy objectives were, the first objective of it wasn't so much to reduce public sector wages, but to help reduce upward pressure on private sector wages and salaries. That's because there's a lot of correlation between public and private sector wages. So we've got a conservative class-based agenda, which involves attack on working people, selective austerity, cuts to social supports, OAS, intensification of contingent and precarious work, undermining of labor rights and protections, and business control over immigration. This was recently announced by Jason Kenney, use of disposable temporary foreign workers. Strengthening power of capital, corporate tax cuts, commodification of public services, but then also environmental deregulation to aid faster capital accumulation through resource exploitation, and then investor protection, free trade agreements, which is what Harper is doing right now over in Asia. There's another important element to it. Chris talked a little bit about this, suppressing democracy, elimination of federal funding for advocacy activities, cuts to NGOs. There's a bill C-377 that was introduced. It's probably going to be reintroduced, which will hamstring labor unions from engaging in advocacy. Vilification of opponents on the environmental side. Elimination of constructive political dialogue, and then electoral shenanigans, as they call it. So how to respond, and I think that's where we want to get to. I think we'd be foolish not to take up what the Occupy movement has started. People moving into neoliberal economics has clearly failed. We even have people like Don Drummond questioning some of his approaches, and other mainstream economists basically saying that the things that they had advocated for years weren't working. Class divisions are deepening and becoming more apparent. I think there's an opportunity to move beyond diverse alliance-based extra-parliamentary politics. And we need to expose the contradictions. The fair tax campaigns can do that by exposing the contradiction that they, in different ways, that governments are cutting corporate taxes at the same time that they're cutting social spending to balance budgets. Look at the cost of privatization and the market solutions. Need to resist commodification of both public services but also environmental goods. Broaden alliances and strengthen solidarity in different ways. Another real challenge is just working time. People are working harder, more intensively. It's hard to get people mobilized if they're just working constantly. We need to reduce working time, and we need to, in a variety of ways, get people engaged through greater democratization of some of our structures as well. These are very vague and general things to talk about, but I think Joel is now going to talk about some ways that he is engaged the public in different campaigns. There's a great quote here in terms of the public and private sector wages. I'll just finish up with this. I've done a study that Sheila referred to. It's called Battle of the Wages, comparing public and private sector wages. American writer Les Leopold said, "Do public sector workers earn more than private sector workers? Who cares? This boneheaded question has us fighting over the crumbs. The real question is, why have most workers seen their standard of living stall over the last generation?" And I think that's what we need to focus on as well. Thanks.